the market right now is the tightest I've ever seen it. There are far more opportunities than there are superstars to build those opportunities. Really making that human connection helps tremendously. Don't assume that the way you've always done it is the way you need to do it for the long haul.
Hi, my name is Rohit Bassi, and welcome to the People Quotient podcast, where we focus on the most important asset in your organization, your people. In this podcast, I'll be speaking with CEOs, investors, and executives from around the world to learn how they build high-performing teams. But before we get going, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you like what you hear, give us a thumbs up and invite your friends and colleagues to also join the community. Without further ado, let's listen in. Curious about how executive search firms work or how they partner with companies to help them find next-level talent? My guest, Shana Plott, CEO and owner of CLCB, shares with us how she partners with companies and private equity funds to help them build management teams. Let's tune in. Hi, Shana. How are you? It's so good to see you. So glad that you're here.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. I'm super excited because only have you and I worked together in the past, and you've helped me find some really talented people, but also I think what you do as an operator, but also the markets that you serve, there's a lot of interesting blend and a lot of learnings that I'm pretty sure I don't know many of them. And so both me and those listening would love to hear all your words of wisdom, especially as you help companies build their teams. But before I go into that, why don't we have you give your background so we know a bit about you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm a North Carolina girl. I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and then attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I got a degree that was actually clinical in nature. And I think one of the early formative pieces of my journey was this. I had a job offer at the major hospital in in Chapel Hill, that's part of the university system, which was a highly coveted role. And I came home and announced to my parents that I was not going to take the job, but I was actually going to pack up my Honda Accord and head out west with my college boyfriend and follow the Grateful Dead and camp across the country. Now, mind you, I had never pitched a tent in my life, nor had I ever seen a Dead show. So my parents picked themselves up off the floor, but sent me on my way, told me they would not fund this, but if at any point I needed to come home, they would pay for one-way ticket home. So off we went. I picked up odd jobs. We pinched pennies, and it was an incredibly great journey. So it was definitely a very formative time in my life, and certainly at the beginning of my career. But I moved to Charlotte. I worked for a healthcare facility. I was hired for a job that I was woefully underqualified to do. I'd never worked as a therapist other than my practicum work, and I'd never managed a person in my life. But for some crazy reason, I got hired to manage a team of 12 therapists across 3 facilities. And so I learned a tremendous amount about what to do well and what not to do in managing people. But I ended up staying in healthcare for several years and moved into marketing and fundraising. And then one day I got this crazy call from a recruiter who was looking for a person to join a large executive search firm, Heidrick & Struggles, that was coming to Charlotte. Now, I knew nothing about search. I'd never heard of this firm with this weird and crazy name. But for whatever reason, I had a sense of adventure and I went and met with them, and it was possibly the luckiest day of my life. The managing partner hired me as his associate. He'd opened several offices around the country for Heidrick, and he taught me a tremendous amount, everything about the search business and frankly, everything about business. Rohit, I didn't know what a P&L was when I joined him at Heidrick. He didn't kick me out the door. He did laugh, but he just kept rolling and explained so much to me. So I spent about 4.5 years at Heidrick, had just tremendous opportunity and was able to do a lot more than many associates are just by virtue of working with someone that was legendary in the firm. Then one day I sadly stepped away. I had 3 kids in a very short amount of time, 2.5 years to be exact. No multiples in there. But I knew at some point I'd go back to search. So I did a little bit of work in the not-for-profit space for the next few years when my kids were very young. And then I was introduced to Chuck Liu, who founded the firm where I am today. He founded the firm about 30 years prior to me joining. And for some crazy reason, I decided to jump back in the deep end. So I joined Coleman Liu, worked really supporting him for a very brief period of time, then moved into a consultant role, built my own book of business, ultimately ended up co-owning the firm with Chuck for a period of time. And then he retired about 5 years ago, bought him out, and then also merged with a small New York firm and became Coleman Liu Canny Bowen, CLCB for short. It's a crazy name. We sound like a law firm, but today we're an executive search firm that does searches across just about every industry sector you can imagine. We do a tremendous amount, as you know, for private equity owned portfolio companies, but also cover, big, large public companies as well. But we pretty much recruit at the C level and then sometimes one level down, typically recruiting individuals to either lead a functional area in a company or a business unit within a much larger company. So that's a little bit about my journey. So today I'm the majority owner of the firm. I also manage the day-to-day operations, but I also carry a full search load because doing search is really what I love the most. So I will likely continue to do that piece of the business as long as I'm still kicking.
That's amazing. First of all, congratulations. It's such an amazing journey. I'm sure I'm not sure, but I'm quite sure that when you were leaving on that road trip many years ago, you wouldn't be dreaming of being a CEO, owner of a business, hiring people. I think that it's amazing how, when people talk about multi-year plans and, when I was younger, I used to talk about that a lot myself, my 10-year plan and many years down the road, what I'll be doing. And the reality is we don't know what the journey will be on. And so you just take the step which makes you and brings that passion and joy, which is exactly what you did and have been doing consistently. And I use the word crazy, that you were crazy doing certain things. But the reality is that every step of the way, sounds like you just followed what sounded exciting, sounded interesting at the time. And you just took a leap of faith and had good people around you to help you along the way. And does that sound familiar as to what got you here?
It absolutely does. And just to bring it full circle, so I mentioned to you, I have 3 kids. They're all in college. My oldest graduates in a couple of months. And because I need to practice what I preach, I have swallowed hard when he has come home and announced to us that he wants to go try and play professional poker for a period of time before getting an office job.
Yeah.
So we'll see how that goes. I don't know that I'll say much except go for it. Give it a shot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at least you know that what sort of freedom that brings in terms of mindset. So, and you yourself are a living example of, hey, you don't have to follow the traditional path out of college. But yet here we are. There's so much in your background that, we could go in so many different directions. Maybe we start with, when you think, because you are in the people business and, that's what you do. You find great people to join great companies. And when you look back through your time, whether it was in the medical space or, talent acquisition previously, for profit, not for profit, where do you think you picked up the most? You build your foundation for people principles. Were there any moments or any experiences that really gave you that foundation that you use even today?
Yeah. Well, I think from a very early age, I have had this incredible fascination with meeting people from all walks of life. My kids have always teased me that I was the person who will talk to anybody in the grocery store or the mall or what have you. And I think that really has transcended my career in a number of different ways, whether it was when I worked in healthcare and I was then a fundraiser and connecting with people asking for money, or whether it then transferred into executive search. But I think that natural curiosity for what makes people tick has certainly been very formative for me. The other thing I've always said is that I'm not good at a lot of things, but I think my superpower is I'm a really good listener. And I miss very little, which can once again be incredibly frustrating, probably to my husband and my children. But I think it has served me well in this industry in terms of getting to know people, asking the next question, really connecting to understand what's important to them, to really suss out when I need to listen to my gut if something doesn't sound right, and those kinds of things. So that's probably the attribute that I think has served me best
Yeah.
in terms of being able to evaluate that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think when you talk about a superpower being good listeners, do you think is that what differentiates a good recruiting partner from others out there who are trying to build their firms, or is there something beyond being a good listener that really has helped you get to the levels of success that you achieved?
Well, I think it's definitely part of the equation. And what I hear from my clients quite often is that consultants will come in and fully prepared to already have all the answers, to know exactly what they need, and to try to really push them in a direction. I take a different approach. I like to go in and meet with the potential client, hopefully having some experience and some knowledge about their space or the function for which they're recruiting. But I really go in assuming nothing. And I'd rather ask lots and lots of questions rather than assume I have the answer or have the right candidate, but to really recognize that it's not a one size fits all proposition. And so really taking the time up front to understand everything you can about a company, both from the nuts and bolts side of things, but also the culture, the fit, pain points, all of that, I think is incredibly important. And it's something that sometimes gets short circuited by some recruiters.
Yeah.
But we take great pride in spending a lot of that upfront time.
Yeah, it's really an interesting approach because I think to your point, having pre-baked solutions is void of knowing the context, isn't it? And a lot of times understanding the path that the company is following or wants to follow. Because part of the reason they want to partner up with you is for them to find executives to be able to get to that level that they're aspiring to get to. Now, in some cases, I'm guessing it's a reactive search where somebody decided to leave. And so it's filling a role. And in some cases, it's more proactive. If you were to sort of guess, and I won't hold you to the exact numbers, but if you had to guess how much of what you do is helping replace someone that was already there a role, the role may have been now different, like they tweak it, but essentially the core of it was there. This is, hey, we've never hired somebody like this before, right? In the company, this is a new role, or we are new in terms of the way we operate. How much of it is sort of filling versus building?
Yeah. That's a great question. And if I were to guess at that, I would say it's probably about 60% replacing an executive that has exited the business, 40% newly created roles. Now, having said that, I would also tell you that even when it's replacing an existing role, we feel very strongly that a company should not just say, okay, go find us more of that. We're sad this person left. He did a great job. Go find us someone like him. We really take a very disciplined, let's slow it down approach to really understand what was awesome about this person. What is different about your business today and your needs today? And based on that, what might you need that looks different than the person who is exiting the business? So we will ask a lot of those tough probing questions to really ascertain, are we looking for exactly what they had prior to, or is it something quite different? And more times than not, we find that there are definitely some different characteristics, experiences, attributes that most companies are looking for, even if it is a replacement role.
Yeah. It almost sounds like, Shana, that you get into growth strategy a bit for the company, right? Because without understanding what you effectively are saying is don't copy paste, because because copy paste wouldn't work for you anyway, even if you wanted to, because you are different from what you were before that person was in that seat. And so you're obviously trying to be, and by the sound of it, you're also effectively coaching them to think about what different world they want to build, right? And
Yes.
whether or not they've thought about it, your sort of nudge is to really help them, think bigger or differently. Do you find yourself in strategic conversations, as in thinking about, as a result of this line of questioning, that it actually allows you or forces the conversation to go into, and force may be a strong word, maybe the right word is, channeled the conversation into a strategy discussion? And really, do you find that to be the case?
Yes, I absolutely do. And, our model of search is a very high touch, highly consultative model of search. And actually, Rohit, I remember distinctly having this conversation with you the very first time you and I met to
Yeah.
talk about a CEO search. And I think I said to you, we'd love to do one search for you. However, I am far more interested in really getting to know your business, establishing a relationship with you such that let us do one, let you see the good work we can do. And
Yeah.
let's hope that based on that relationship and that upfront investment of time and trust in this relationship, in this process, that it becomes kind of a no brainer when other needs come along. And that with that, you call us and say, let me bounce this off of you. This is what we're thinking. Does this make sense? Have you ever seen this before? What worked? What did not? We do lots of work that looks just like that. And by the way, with our clients, we don't even charge for that consultation. And we take great pride in that service and that relationship. And as a result of that, something like 85% of our business comes from current or former clients or referrals from those same people. And if you'll recall, that's how you and I met, was through a referral from another mutual colleague. So again, when you think about that repeat business, we have lots of clients that we've done 10, 15, 20 plus searches for. And I think a lot of that is based on having the opportunity to be at the table with them and consult as they really are setting that talent strategy on a go-forward basis.
Yes, it's for those listening, because a lot of small media businesses who are listening, and whether they're owners, investors, operators listening to this thing, they're probably, one question that I've received a lot is, hey, recruiting partners can be expensive. I'm not entirely sure if I can get what I need out of them, and, why I can do the work myself. And I'm sure you've heard all of these over and over again. And I think
Sure.
my counsel usually to them is that, it cannot hurt to have a conversation with somebody who's very intelligent, knows about the market. If
Right.
anything, you learn more about the market. Second, they may ask you questions that you learn more about your own business and help you think differently. And then, if there is chemistry and there is a good connection on the topic itself, and then you feel like, oh, maybe they can help, it could only accelerate your acquisition of that talent. It
Yeah.
sounds like that's exactly what you're getting, is like you're offering the first two pro bono, not because that's a business development ploy, but you genuinely want to help and help
That's
them
right.
cover the nuggets that they've been, thinking about, not thinking about exactly the way they, it's always good to have a partner. Really. That's what partnership
Absolutely.
is about. And so
Yeah.
it's like you're a thought partner before you're a search partner, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's so important because, it's a nice little test drive on both sides.
Yeah.
Because I do think it's important to, and obviously it takes time to fully evaluate this, but I think I've got a pretty good gut. And I always ask myself when we consider taking on a new engagement, do I feel like we have chemistry and synergy? Does it seem that we will listen to each other? Do we trust each other? And do we kind of like each other? Not that you have to be best friends, but as you well know, our model of search is a partnership. And so it does still require a high level of engagement on behalf of the hiring manager, the owners of a company. And so I think that synergy and alignment is really important. And listen, at the end of the day, I don't have all the answers. What I always say to clients is, I feel like as your paid consultant, I have a fiduciary responsibility to tell you what I think. However, as long as you don't ask me to do something illegal or unethical, my job is then to help you get the person that you want. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, look, I think it's a really good framing of the value proposition, right? Which is, it's not just somebody who's going to go get a task done. They're really an advisor to you. And so what you're saying is the better recruiting partners are better advisors first. Then they are, they also need to be good at the job. So they're not saying that they don't have to be, but you get both, and getting one doesn't really always get you to the finish line in the same way that having a consultative, strategic conversation where somebody's really getting to know you, your business, and then what you're solving for, and helping you solve for that. One question you triggered over there in that last sentence was, you, by the sounds of it, you obviously, and I know that a large portion of your work comes from private equity, where private equity firms bring you in and to help their portfolio companies.
Yeah.
And so that there relies a sort of two-tiered relationship, right? So there's a relationship that, going back to your point about chemistry and listening. And so, and obviously trust. Who do you have to do that twice? Because you've got the firm and then you've got the portfolio, who obviously is being introduced by the firm. And so,
right.
Does the firm like a one-time thing and then really it's all the portfolio? How does that work? Just for those who are listening, how does that double relationship work?
Well, I think the short answer is it depends. Typically, we are engaged by the owner, by the private equity firm. Sometimes they will include, a CEO or an owner that's selling a portion of the company in that decision, in the process of selecting the firm. In that case, certainly we are working heavily with both parties. Occasionally, we're doing a confidential replacement search, in which case we're not talking to anyone in the company for obvious reasons. And so, certainly we do plenty of confidential searches, and that has its own set of nuances that are a part of that. But when it's a regular search where everyone knows the search is being conducted, we think it's very important to work with a private equity firm who's typically hired us. And we know at the end of the day, we really answer to them. However, we find that we get great insight into the culture, the company, all of that from the boots on the ground in the company. We also find that engaging them, allowing them to have a voice in the process, also greatly enhances or increases the likelihood of them being in the huddle with the owners when the selection is made and supporting the selection of this new leader really kind of from day one. Whether it was the person they wanted or not, at least they had a voice and were engaged in the process.
Yeah. And if you, again, I apologize for making to quantify things, but I can't help myself, but if you were to think about what percentage of your work is through the private equity relationship and how much of it is directly with the portfolio or an operating company? It doesn't have to be a PE back, right? It could be any operating company.
Yeah.
What's your general sense?
So we are probably engaged by private equity firms for about 60% of the searches that we do.
Yeah.
We do some searches for PE owned companies where I'll give you a great example. We were retained by a New York firm to hire a CEO for a business that they bought in Texas. We did that search and worked almost exclusively with the private equity owners as our primary point of contact. We met some of the other folks in the company, but they engaged us. They were choosing the CEO. They were really our clients. They made the selection of the CEO. Thankfully, they were very pleased with the work that we'd done. Then the CEO engaged us really to build out his entire executive leadership team. Yeah. So in those instances, certainly with the CFO, the PE guys were very involved and certainly had a vested interest in who that selection was. Some of the other searches, maybe they would meet one or two finalists, but we really at that point were dealing predominantly with the CEO.
Got it. Very interesting. Changing tack for a second. So, I've been through many executive searches where either I've been part of the candidate pool or on the other side, looking for executives to join my portfolio companies. And one thing I know is no matter where you sit, it's exhausting, right? It's an exhausting process. And it's an exhaustive process, right? The right process is exhaustive because there's only a few hours. How do you inject fun in all of that? Like, how do you make it fun for yourself, make it fun for the client?
Yeah.
Because it can be a long journey, right? We want it done in
Right.
weeks, but usually it takes months for the right person to
That's
get
right.
it. And where does fun come in all of this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And I'm sort of a goofball at heart. And so I never take myself too seriously. I take the work that we do very seriously,
Yeah.
but I try not to take myself so seriously. So I told you that from an early age, I've had this natural curiosity about meeting people and understanding what makes them tick and connecting with them. And I have been dubbed the nickname of Oprah in my firm. And the reason for that is that I've had a lot of interviews where candidates have bared their soul to me and cried and told me some of their most formative, tender moments of life and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So I do think really connecting with people, being very real, taking the time to understand their journey over and above what you see on a resume, because to me, a resume only means just so much. But I think really making that human connection helps tremendously.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. And then I also think along the way, really celebrating some of the wins that we have is critically important. And then lastly, I would tell you, and this is less about the fun, but it's part of just treating people well and respectfully and having a healthy dose of compassion. I can't tell you how many times I've released a candidate when a client passed on them and they've said, "Oh my goodness, thank you so much for calling to tell me." I never hear from search firms when I'm released. They just go dark. And certainly, as you can imagine, that's the part of my job I like the least,
Yeah.
but it's so important. So again, I think it's a matter of really taking the time to go over and beyond to really take care of your candidates and take care of your clients. I'm a straight shooter and you know that. And my belief firmly with clients, with the hiring managers, is that there should be no surprises.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to tell you all the good stuff and I'm going to tell you all of the challenges and the wonky circumstances around anybody's candidacy. Because again, we're dealing with human beings, not widgets. Nobody's perfect. Every situation's got some clunky something that client's going to have to work through. So I believe in just being very real and hopefully minimizing the surprises, which I think also adds a little bit of levity to the process as well.
Yeah, no, I think the way you were talking about it and what you said, and maybe you didn't use this word, but there's a lot of respect. I think that's what you're really bringing out. I think you're able to establish trust very quickly in those examples that you were giving. Otherwise, people don't open up. And so there's a very high level of emotional intelligence. And maybe it goes back to the days when you're managing all those therapists in your training,
Right.
like probably where it's all coming from. But I think building that respect allows you to get deeper into that conversation.
Yeah.
So maybe two-part question. One is that when you're having these conversations, maybe because you touched on the client side a little bit, maybe we go to a candidate side for a second. What are the attributes that you are looking, because you've got the resume in front of you, it is what it is. And we can talk a little bit about how to look at a resume, and see what's good, what's not from a generic level. But given you've talked about your Oprah skills, I would love to hear, what are you looking for and what are your sort of favorite or questions that you enjoy asking? Because I think there are questions that anybody can ask, but there's like an inherent, I love this question because it just leads to fun or deeper, richer conversation. Like two-part question, you can pick any.
Yeah. So speaking of the resume first, I mean, look, the way I see it, a resume is really important and I certainly use it when I do an interview, but it's a marketing piece that was prepared by the candidate. So obviously take that for what it's worth. But I mentioned to you that I think it's really important to get to know people. So, typically I'll sit down in an interview. There are certainly areas that differ from search to search that are important to probe more deeply based on what that client needs. Again, going back to there is no one size fits all kind of proposition. Having said that, when I interview somebody, I do take a little different approach and I hear that quite often. I'll hit some of the key points right out of the gate. Tell me why you're interested. What's your motive, whether you're looking for a job or not? You took our call. Tell me why you're willing to invest the time to look at this. And that really sort of sets the tone for the conversation. So, I'll talk through that. I'll go ahead and hit things like relocation, compensation expectations. Obviously, today you have to be careful with how you frame that in certain states, but we'll try to get at that as much as we can. And certainly clients have an expectation that we're going to have some framework to share with them around that topic. And then once we get through those key components that could make something a very short conversation, I'll say to a candidate, now listen, I have sort of this funky way of interviewing, so just bear with me. We're going to get to your resume in a little while. But before we get there, I want to understand everything that I can about what made you the great executive you are today. So before we hit your resume, tell me a little bit about early formative years of little Rohit. So let's take it birth through high school. Where'd you grow up? What was life like? What were you like as a kid? Whatever you're comfortable sharing. And, typically you learn a lot about people. Quite often they'll say, wow, that's a great question. No one's ever asked me that in an interview. Or every now and then you'll get someone who says, oh, that's my favorite question. I always ask people I'm interviewing that. But it's great to really understand, what were those formative years like? Did you grow up with a very privileged upbringing? Did you have to work and scrap for every extra that you ever had? What did your parents do for a living? Do you have siblings? Where do you fall in the birth order? Tell me what that looked like in your house. Were you a good student in high school? Were you just naturally smart, or did you have to work hard for those grades? Did you have a job? When did you start working? Did you play sports? Did you have other activities? Did you know you were going to college? Was that a given? Who paid for college? Tell me about that. We'll talk through those years, and then let's hit the resume and step through it. Certainly, I always want to understand some of the nuts and bolts around who you report to. What was your scope of responsibility? Why did you leave from job to job? One of the things that I'm always very interested in is, did you get promoted within one company, or did you have to change companies to get a bigger job? I think that can be very telling about candidates. I also like to take sort of a back to front approach. Tell me what things were like when you got there, and what were they like when you left, and what did you do to impact that journey, good or bad? You can learn a lot about really what was the impact that they made. And then I'll talk about, what do you want to be when you grow up? What's your ultimate goal? What's your dream job? And that could be whether somebody's got 10 more years left in their career, or they're 5 years out of business school, and everything in between.
Yeah.
And then after that, I think it's important to really understand, what would people tell me about you? What would your teammates tell me about you? What would people who report to you tell me about you as a leader? How would they describe you? What do you need to work on? And then, I always like to understand, how do you recharge? What do you do to, reboot your energy, all of that. And then typically at that point, you'll get some clues also around, family dynamics, anything that might impact their ability or interest in taking another job. And then, I always close with parting words. What have I not asked you that you want me to know? Or more importantly, what would you like my client to know?
Yeah.
And there's usually some interesting stuff that'll come as a result of that as well. So some of those things may seem a little weird, but I'm a big believer that how you do anything is how you do everything. And so there are definitely some common threads that I'll look for across that journey of growing up and then a career journey as well.
I love it. This is great. I think, look, I stopped taking notes down because there's like so many good things. I was going to listen back to all of this. So whoever's listening, you're
Awesome.
play it back. But I think if I was to step back and look at what you're really helping a candidate do in those questions, is being very self-reflective. And I think really, if I had to summarize that, for people listening, that self-reflection, some people do it all the time. Some people never do it. And so I think part of what you're doing in this conversation with them is creating a space, a safe enough space, because it's not given that it'll be safe because they don't know you yet. But by the way you ask the questions and you set the scene, you're really allowing them to have an opportunity to be self-reflective. And in that journey, in that hour that you spend with them, where they go, what they share, how they say it, all of that is telling, right? And all of that reveals
Right.
who they are, because at the end of the day, that's where you're trying to get to. Because whether, as you said, whether it's the CEO or other CXOs or division leaders, they're going to be, that I've always said that's a very lonely role. I've been in
Right.
almost all of those roles, and it's a very lonely spot because you don't really know. And so by knowing yourself the best, you have a, guiding set of principles that you can then use. And so what I think you might be, and tell me if that's your ultimate goal, is, what are those principles? Or what are those things that drives, motivates, guides? Those are words that people use, but really fundamentally are grounding for this individual. And
Yeah.
that's because they're going to take on bigger jobs when they go to your client, right? These are not
Right.
small responsibilities. They'll be responsible for people, but they'll also be responsible for businesses and growth and customers and all of the above. And so really it's a self-reflective set of questions, which are amazing. I mean, I think even if people ask half of them, they'll
Yeah.
learn a lot more
Yeah.
than tell me more about your resume, which is usually when I hear that question, walk me through your resume. I'm like, we're 30 years back still if we're asking that question.
Right.
And
That's right.
also, it's less about a judgment. It's more about such a amazing opportunity that gets missed when you only have 60 minutes
Yeah.
and to get to know someone and really help you get to know them. If you ask certain questions, they'll answer the questions that you ask, right? So it's your job as an interviewer to essentially run the process and get the most out, while also, by the sounds of it, enjoying the conversation,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
'Cause-
Well, and I think, you make a great point in calling it a safe space. And, look, I'm a big believer that just about anybody that's worked for 30 years probably has gotten fired at some point.
yeah,
And I do think so many people go into an interview and it's a really nervous thing, waiting for the dreaded conversation to come up about this one job that either my role was eliminated or we had a mutual parting of ways. The company decided to go in another direction. So I really try to keep that real and grounded and share with them, don't sugarcoat it. Just shoot
yeah,
straight with me. What happened? What'd you learn from it? What came out of the back end of it? I think that's a really important conversation to have. And then lastly, I think with the self-reflection, look, my theory as a search consultant is I don't believe in talking people into taking jobs. Now, certainly we are salespeople and we are recruiting and evaluating simultaneously. So it's our job to sell an opportunity. But I've been doing this for a long time and it virtually never works out for the long run if you have to talk someone into take a job. And I make that very clear right out of the gate. So I do think there are those times when having a very real, honest conversation with an opportunity for that self-reflection and me being fairly direct about the needs of a business in a respectful but direct way. Some candidates do opt out. And the way I see it, that's probably better for everybody.
Oh, I completely agree. I think, it has to be the right thing for everyone involved. And in your case, it's not just the two people, the candidate and the operating company, but also there's the sponsor, the investor, right? Because depending on the
Yes.
role, they will have a lot of exposure to the candidate as well, or the candidate to them. And so I think it is a complex set of relationships that will have to successfully work out for long term beyond your involvement, obviously, right? And so I think having the right person in the right seat, and a sort of overused statement, but often people say that, and yet you see a lot of people who shouldn't be in places. And it's not that it's not just good for the company. It's actually not good for them because they're not thriving.
Right.
It's do the right thing for them, which is help them
Yeah.
thrive. And I think in this conversation, to your point, if you can help them and figure out that this may not be the right fit for them in that respectful way, I think it serves everybody. And as you said in one of your conversations that when, previously, that when you turn people down, you're doing it respectfully, that then leads to, them and you spend time getting to know them, right? So now you've also built a potential pool for another opportunity downstream. And so
Yeah.
creates a really good energy around the entire ecosystem where there's already respect. So you don't have to start from scratch. And so it's a lot easier,
Right.
try to either rush it or to do it in a way that's unprofessional or too salesy that it doesn't really serve, and people see through it. People are smart.
Right.
I always said that candidates are way smarter than people give them credit. like,
That's
you're like,
absolutely right.
so, I find it really funny when employers feel like it's a one-sided thing. And I'm like, actually, it's not at all. In
Right.
fact,
And certainly not in today's market.
no.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little
Right.
bit about today's market, Shana. Like, what are a few things? Obviously, there's virtualization from pandemic, but then there are other things that remote working in general, even if you're not virtual, you're not working as much at the office. But from a macro perspective, when you look at the supply demand for
Yeah.
top talent, how are things shaping up and what are you seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah. So I think the market right now is the tightest I've ever seen it in all of my years of search. I think there are far more opportunities than there are superstars to fill those opportunities. Doesn't mean there aren't plenty of warm bodies you can plug in, but really that tier one kind of A team talent, there's less of that and more opportunity, which certainly helps our business. But with that, I think clients are more demanding today and, the pool of candidates is smaller. So, there are a few things that I tell clients in today's market. One, you need to be prepared that searches may take a little longer than they might have in more normal times just a few months ago. Secondly, you need to be prepared to pay a little more than you might initially have thought you were going to pay in terms of compensation. And lastly, the third, and I think this is the most important part, is to say you need to be prepared to move on it when you meet the right person. I think gone are the days of, we love this candidate, just keep him warm and let's go see a few more, because time and time again, our clients that continue down that path are losing every single time. CFOs specifically, this is an incredibly tight market for really good CFO talent. And I think because of that, it is almost inevitable that just about every time we almost get to the finish line with the finalist, that finalist has a couple of offers. And if they are gainfully employed, their employer is doing everything they can to hang on tight. It used to be that counteroffers were such a dirty word and it never worked. And by the way, I'm still not a huge proponent of them because I think they're risky. However, they are more commonplace today than I think they were a few years ago, just in terms of, companies know when they've got something good and they know that replacing that is hard. So they're doing everything they can to keep them engaged and from leaving.
Yeah, it's, I'd maybe tweak one thing from my experience, which is some companies know they've got something good because clearly they're,
Correct.
I think,
Yeah.
and do you find yourself coaching? These are some amazing coaching points, by the way, and I love all of them. Time and speed, time for it to play through, and the speed of execution, decision making. I think that's I've seen it myself firsthand, and it definitely it can be a competitive advantage, really. And so I think it's not just you have to do this to play the game, but it is, if you can, the faster you can move, the quicker
That's
you're
right.
going to be able to close on the candidate, and you're going to build your company sooner, right? And so the question for you was that, do you find yourself coaching your clients, whether it's on the private equity side or the operating side, on talent retention in this, even though they've brought you in to find someone, do you give them counsel on everyone else that's there? They're like, hey, look,
Sure.
hold on to them because of what you said about
Yes.
the market?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a conversation we have quite often. I have a relatively new client who, this is a family owned company. She is third generation. She has just been named president of the company, and her father, who is going to be retiring, asked me to come and meet with them and establish this relationship. They didn't have a search just yet, and we've since done some work for them. But I felt like it was really important to drive 5 hours to spend a day with her and really invest in that relationship for the future. And part of that conversation that first day was around exactly that topic of, I'm a new leader, I'm a first time president. What are the things that we need to do, especially as we are slowly requiring our team to come back to the office and all of that. How do we keep them motivated, engaged, retained? And so, yes, we're often called upon to have some conversation around that. And I do think, it is things like flexibility in terms of where you work. Maybe it's a hybrid work schedule. Maybe it's other perks. Maybe it's unlimited PTO. We're seeing a number of things like that might not just be a monetary raise, but sometimes those perks and that flexibility and that freedom to make good choices is far more attractive than a little bump in pay.
That's really helpful because I think small, medium business owners listening to you, look, I can't just keep throwing money at jobs, right? Because I'm going back to the point around P&L, there's only so much I can give. And so, but what you just highlighted, it's some creative ways to make your job, your company fun, attractive to come join. And yes, there is money that is important. Everyone's got to pay the bills, but what else can you be thinking about creatively?
Right.
Sounds like you also get involved in that conversation, helping companies who may not be able to come up to a very high or beyond market rate, saying what else can you do? Do you get involved in topics around, equity and incentive programs and option pools, or is that something?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we're quite often very involved in that conversation. We're able to share, what other companies of similar sizes and structures are doing. We've got a good beat on the market. I always tell clients, this is not market data. We are not compensation experts, but we talk to people all day, every day about this topic. So we have a lot of market intelligence, which can be incredibly helpful in terms of being competitive. And so much goes into that in terms of where they are in the deal life cycle. And is there equity left to give? And if not, are there transaction bonuses? Are there team incentives? Things like that you can put into place to really incent leaders to think like owners and really have some skin in the game and stick with you through the ownership cycle.
Yeah, no, totally. I think especially with private equity, depending on when you get brought in for which role, and then subsequently as they're thinking about exit. So there's two big milestones, right? Like the time there's the vision of the platform and then the exit. And then they also like working backwards saying, okay, with the management team that's there, would that be the team that takes you to the exit? And you have to, and how soon before the exit and obviously having lived through that for many years, I think it is the situation. And I think having someone like you by my side allows me as an operator, investor, and whether it's private equity, whether it's VC, whether it's a small, medium business, a large business, to really have that, again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, a thought partner, I think really to get in on various angles. And as you said, it's not just in those sort of, end bookends that you engage. By having you engage throughout the journey allows for the conversation to be present. It doesn't have to be every week, every month, every quarter, but it has to be frequent enough that as an investor, I know how the market's trending. And sometimes you may have candidates that I hadn't even thought about a role, and you're like, I've got someone amazing. Do you need actually, you know what? And that co-creates an opportunity that is also very beautiful. And I've done that many a times where, I wasn't looking, but then just having a conversation with you, you're like, oh my God, that creates a new idea. And then who knows what that leads to. Shana, in the last few minutes that we've got, I'd love for you to maybe leave the listeners with one thing that for all the wisdom that you've shared, if you had to distill it down or something that you haven't shared, back to your question, something that we haven't talked about, one thing that you say as people think about talent acquisition, building their teams, one thing you absolutely should not do, or at least your counsel, please stay away from. And the one thing you're like, what, no matter what you do, please do this. And that'll be your recommendation. It's not a prescription. It's a suggestion.
Yeah. Gosh, good questions. I think on my answers would really be related as point and counterpoint. I think the don't do would be, don't assume that the way you've always done it is the way you need to do it for the long haul. Sometimes that means taking some risk, hopefully well thought out, calculated risks, but really slowing down the process to give yourself that time and space to really think about what do we need to change and do differently, I think is incredibly important. in terms of the don't do. And also, I think probably in terms of the what should you do. And I think to that point, having, whether it's a thought partner in your search consultant, whether it's an executive coach, whether it's an operating partner, whomever it might be, having that close, trusted advisor, sometimes that's not in the guts of the business day in and day out, as someone to bounce ideas off is incredibly helpful. I think we all have a tendency in our own companies to not really pick our head up and see the forest, but having that outside party that knows you, but isn't living it deeply day in and day out is a great way to really challenge your thinking, maybe ask you some probing questions that might stimulate some ideas that might look quite differently than what you've done in the past. So
Yes.
I would say really lean into that person. And I do believe that any really good search partner ought to be more than willing to do that over and above a search that they may be working on for you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This is so much that I learned from just listening to this conversation. It's made me revisit some of the things that you and I talked about some time back. Thank you for taking the time. I can't.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Have a lovely day.
Absolutely.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And there you have it, folks. Another episode of the People Quotient podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please be sure to give us a like and invite your friends and colleagues to join us in this community. Until next time, stay focused on your people. Signing off, Rohit Bassi.